Hello, good evening. Welcome to this event. Many thanks for joining us today to discuss Iraq 20 years on, how Bush and Blair's imperialist war devastated a nation. It's been organised by Labour Outlook, which is a fast-growing website bringing you daily news and views from Labour's left and those at the forefront of resisting the Tories. The event is kindly being hosted online and streamed by the Arise Festival. The recent honouring of Tony Blair with a knighthood rightly provoked a massive backlash, not least because of the disaster that was the Iraq War. And this event today is looking to tell the truth about what happened in the Iraq War 20 years ago last week, and to firmly rebut all those who would seek to rewrite the history of what happened in order to justify a reactionary foreign policy agenda today. To discuss this, we're joined today by Iraqi anti-war and justice campaigner Sami Ramadani, an international guest, Medea Benjamin from the peace movement in the US, and Shadia Edwards-Dashti of Stop the War Coalition. The point of these Labour Outlook forums is to enable in-depth discussion, so we want to have as many questions and comments from the audience as possible. But because of the size of the audience, I'm pleased to say hundreds of people have registered in advance. We'll have volunteers who are going to be facilitating this through the Q&A function in Zoom rather than the chat. So if you've got a comment or a question, please submit those through Q&A. And then we will have time for a few rounds of questions from the audience after the speakers have finished, and there'll also be a chance for some shout outs to people. Please, if I can ask you, if you're in a position to make a donation to the streaming costs, that would be fantastic. And you could also become a supporter of Labour Outlook on Patreon so it can increase its web presence and put on more events. I think there'll be details of how to do that put in the chat today. Thank you again for joining us. I think it's going to be a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion. Without further ado, we'll move to our first speaker, Sami Ramadani, an Iraqi anti-war campaigner whose formidable campaigning over many years will be familiar to many of you. Thank you, Sami.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you for making the effort to commemorate this tragic event in many ways. What I will focus tonight on is the situation in Iraq today, and also try and link what goes on in Iraq today briefly towards the end to the events happening today in terms of the potential for war and perhaps even terrifyingly a world war because of the recent events and escalation of war in Ukraine. But obviously, primarily, my task tonight is to talk about Iraq and what happened in terms of the invasion and occupation of the country 20 years ago. Now, I say 20 years ago, but with a very important condition attached, which is that that invasion and occupation was not merely an event that happened 20 years ago. I would like to stress the point that the occupation and invasion of Iraq still has current manifestations. My own assessment is that Iraq is still a semi-occupied, semi-independent country. There are US forces present in Iraq, several military bases. Iraq is used as a base of aggression against neighboring countries, especially Iran and Syria. And the United States has an active presence in the country aside from its military forces. Obviously, I'm assuming that we are all familiar with the immediate impact within the first few years of the invasion and occupation of the country in terms of the casualties, the death toll reaching 1 million people, millions being orphaned, maimed, injured, and so on. That aspect of it is known to all. But in terms of the longer term impact on the country, it's absolutely massive. The occupation set up a very corrupt state based on sectarian divisions, and those sectarian divisions have a real impact on the country because the political forces that the United States backed or they chose to cooperate with the United States have taken hold of the state apparatus of the country. So the state itself, and I use the term state rather loosely because, as I will explain, there is no strong central state in Iraq anymore. The country is divided into practically 3 regions, Kurdistan in the north, a so-called Sunni area in the west and north, and Baghdad downwards being mostly Shia. So the political parties that vie for power have taken on board that they do represent these sects or ethnicities, and the state power is divided accordingly. And division of power relates to the division of the economic wealth of Iraqi society. So the struggle is over who controls most of the wealth produced in the country. And the United States is a decisive political factor in the middle, whether it's through its military and intelligence presence, through its US embassy, still the biggest in the world, and through other mechanisms. One of the most important mechanisms that the US uses in Iraq is an economic one. Iraqi oil sales are conducted in the dollar. It goes through US Federal Bank. So every barrel of oil that Iraq produces, and 95% of Iraqi state budget comes from oil resources, selling the oil. Every dollar goes through US Federal Bank. Iraqi reserves are also held by the over 50 billion of Iraqi reserves are held by the US Federal Bank. And this domination of Iraq's, if you like, daily budget is quite massive. And the US exercises enormous power over any Iraqi government. And the other sort of important levers that the US has are quite varied. One is through the political forces that they back, sometimes finance, sometimes arm. They have secret militias in the country and so on. But what they also do is create a climate. And the way they create a climate in the country is through their domination of the media. So the US has a very powerful social media presence, for example, through well-known personalities, through so-called NGOs that the US set up in Iraq after the occupation. Tens of them, literally tens of NGOs were literally funded by the US occupation authorities after the invasion of Iraq. They operate through TV stations, local TV stations. They operate through the print media, publishing houses. The biggest publishing house in the country, called Al-Mada, is quite close to the US embassy and what it wants. It operates through the biggest political forces in the country, armed political forces, mainly through Barzani. Barzani is the leader of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, one of the main pillars of US presence in Iraq. He has under his command over 100,000 militia force, the Peshmerga, who historically might have played a a positive role in the sense of defending Kurdish people's national rights and so on. But over the decades, gradually, this massive military political force has become allied to the United States, and they train their forces quite publicly. They have a budget which is set by the United States publicly. So this is a very important force that without its blessing, if you like, an agreement, no government can function in Baghdad. Because of the sectarian divisions I mentioned, this is one side that must be pleased in the formation of any central government in Baghdad. So this basis of the three regions of Iraq being divided that way was originally suggested by Biden, today's President Biden. It was Senator Biden who suggested it years ago, how to divide Iraq, and centrally, and very importantly, that Iraq, alongside these divisions, must not have a strong central government. This is a red line. Any measures, economic, political, administrative even, which gives more power to the center is a red line. The US Embassy and US will object. So it is essential to have such a weak government. And obviously, if you are backing these sectarian forces, necessarily also the central government will be weakened. But obviously, central government has levers of power, especially in the economic field, in terms of international relations. And once the central government tries to exercise those levers, the US Embassy actively intervenes. I mean, the US ambassador, since this new government was appointed about 3 months ago, has held 45 meetings with the Prime Minister of Iraq, with the President, with the various ministers, with the head of the Iraqi Central Bank. For an ambassador to hold 45 meetings or so with Iraqi officials in itself tells an important story. And she frequently issues statements, conducts interviews explaining how Iraq should and should not behave. The US government, in terms of its levers, objects to certain things. So, for example, 3 years ago, the central government signed a deal with China, and that deal meant giving China 100,000 barrels a day of oil in return for infrastructure projects that China was due to carry out in Iraq. President Trump went mad. Pompeo went mad. They were all phoning and physically going to Iraq as well to put pressure on the Iraqi government to freeze that deal. Iraq canceled a deal with General Electric in favor of Siemens of Germany, so that electricity problems are solved in Iraq. There are electricity cuts in Iraq. In the summer, it's impossible without some electric power. Children suffer enormously with electric cuts and so on. The country gets crippled by lack of electricity, which has suffered enormously since the invasion and occupation of the country. And General Electric failed to do any decent projects in Iraq, despite getting billions of dollars from the central government. So that contract with Siemens again upset the United States. Pompeo called, Trump called, and Iraq was to freeze that contract through overthrowing the government actually. The United States intervened in a public uprising 3 years ago, and that public uprising was obviously entirely legitimate. popular demands and so on, but through the so-called NGOs, through social media, through US embassy agents and so on in the country, they managed to control the main aims of that uprising, leading to the overthrow of Adel Abdel Mahdi's government, who signed the deal with China, who signed the deal with Siemens, who opened the borders with Syria, who refused to implement strict sanctions on Iran and so on. These were all red lines that he crossed. So he was overthrown, and a puppet regime was installed of Kadhimi. This new one,
Sami, sorry to interrupt, but
sure.
If you could draw to a close, it's really fascinating, but I'm just conscious we've got 2 other speakers. That would
yes,
be
of course.
Thank
please, I will. Have I got a couple of minutes?
A couple of minutes would be lovely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. Now, in terms of trying to see where Iraq will be heading, I think without expelling the US forces from Iraq and that power within the country, Iraq could not become a proper independent country to bring prosperity and heal the wounds of its people on many fronts, whether economic, social, condition of women in the country deteriorated, a host of problems that faces Iraq. I mean, the land of Iraq itself is poisoned by depleted uranium. Depleted uranium, as we know, is now being exported by Britain to the Ukrainian government to use in Ukraine. This is a chemical weapon. So in addition to the use of white phosphorus in Iraq, tens of thousands of tons of depleted uranium was used. So there are enormous problems in the country that could not be resolved without expelling the United States' direct and indirect presence in the country. I think the United States today looks as though it's focusing on China and Russia, of course. They are trying to escalate war steps across the world. And their presence in Iraq and the Middle East in general is also one of the anchors, because they do not want to let go of their control of the oil resources, the wealth of that region. They do not want to let go of Israel, their forward military base in the Middle East, against the wishes of the Palestinian people, their rights, and the rights of the people in the area in general. Thousands of US soldiers are in Syria. They are literally stealing Syrian oil under their control, as Trump famously declared, and they still do so today. So we have a situation across the world where US-led imperialism is escalating war preparations, bringing in Japan, Australia, and obviously using the British government and its docile policies, implementing what the US wants in Europe and the Ukraine. What they do in the Ukraine as their own proxy war, and it is a US-led proxy war in many respects in the Ukraine, and they are trying to escalate these tensions. And this is their response to a deep economic crisis, whether in the United States or across Europe. This deep economic crisis is, or they are trying classically, traditionally, through escalation of tensions and war, by supplying all these hundreds of billions of dollars to the war industry, the technology industry related to war, and so on. So the front against imperialism runs from Iraq, Middle East, all the way to Ukraine and Latin America and so on. And unless the peoples of the world unite, this war escalation is going to bring a catastrophe to the world. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sami. Really fascinating, and you've covered a huge amount of ground. Thank you very much. We will be able to take some questions. So if you have got any, reminder, please put them in the Q&A, And do put in where you're from. It's always great to know where people are watching us from. We're very briefly now going to have Sam, one of the Labour Outlook volunteer team, who's just going to tell us a little bit more about today's organisers and maybe urging you to dip into your pockets. Thank you.
Yeah, hi all. It's really good to see so many people on the call. As we said, I am Sam. I'm one of the organisers of Labour Outlook. We're a news and views website of the Labour left, and we organise regular events like today's forum. And obviously, those events, I think, are becoming more and more important, and we're seeing a militarisation of our economy. We're seeing the rising threat of nuclear war. We're seeing mounting global tensions and polarization. So a voice for peace has become more important than perhaps it's been at any time in recent history. And that's where you come in, because there are 3 things that you can do today to help us to continue the work we do in terms of being that voice for peace in British political discourse. The first thing is this: it costs about £200 to run one of these meetings. So that means if 10 people in the audience now donate 20 quid, that's the cost covered. So that's the first request. Please follow the link that's put in the chat and donate to our streaming costs today. The second thing is please check out Labour Outlook. Like I say, we're a news and views website of the Labour left. We bring you those news and views from the front line of struggles against racism, against war, imperialism, austerity, the climate emergency, and many more things. So please check us out. And if you like what you read, please contribute to our Patreon page. You can, again, the link to that will be set up, will be put in the chat. If we have those regular contributions on Patreon, it means we can keep doing the things that we're doing. So please do contribute. The third thing that you can do is come to our next event, come to our next Labour Outlook Forum, Why Palestine Matters, on the 15th of May with Bernard Reagan. Obviously, that's a kind of central issue to the issues we're discussing today and touched upon, in fact, in what Sami just said. So please come to that forum and come and have a chat about why Palestine matters. So those are the 3 things. And there's one more 4th thing. I don't know if I mentioned it. Please donate towards the streaming costs of today's event. Your help really matters, and it means that we can continue doing the really politically important work of fighting for peace, if that's not too much of an oxymoron. Thanks very much, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Sam. And please do support Labour Outlook if you're able to in one of those ways, and they'll be put in the chat. Moving to our next speaker, it's a real honour to have with us today a prominent US peace campaigner, Medea Benjamin from CODEPINK. Medea, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much. So nice to be on with you. And a big hello to Sami, who I have read for so many years and is such an expert on this issue. I want to just look at this from a U.S. perspective, well, U.S.-UK perspective, of course. The way that this 20 years has been evaluated in the U.S. media is somehow this was just a mistake. And the U.S. went in with good intentions, but it just had poor execution. And I think it's so important to try to get across to our peoples that this was a calculated, premeditated crime on a massive scale, and that the perpetrators of this crime have never been held accountable. Sami, I'm glad that you brought up Joe Biden, because we usually talk about Bush and we talk about Tony Blair, and the fact that Tony Blair has been knighted is just absolutely obscene. The fact that George Bush is an elder statesman that goes around painting the pictures of the victims of his war, the U.S. Military victims of his war, is also quite obscene. I happen to be in Texas right now on a Ukraine book tour, and here he has his grand library in Texas, and he is celebrated as this great figure in history, which is remarkable. But there's also Biden, because he was the #1 U.S. architect of this war when he was, as Sami said, head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and decided it would be a good thing to not only invade Iraq, but then divide it into these three sections. And the other architects of this war, and there are so many, continue today in the think tanks to be the experts that we hear on television with their opinions about what's happening in Ukraine. The journalists who were such propaganda mouthpiece for the government continue today. So it is incredible that our, quote, democratic societies are not able to bring to account those who are responsible for such a horrific crime. And of course, the international community is not able to do that with the talk about bringing Vladimir Putin to an international criminal court for the invasion of Ukraine. Many of us also say, yes, and what about Bush and Blair? Sami went through the consequences of these 20 years to show a government that is riddled with corruption, in fact, one of the most corrupt in the world today, the increase of social conservatism in Iraq, the increase in violence against women, the fact that Iraq is still so dependent, over 90% of its exports on oil, that there have been no reparations from the countries that invaded and destroyed Iraq, and that what are the lessons learned? If the lesson you would think they would learn is don't invade and try to engineer another country's politics, of course they didn't learn that. I think what they learned is don't, or try very hard not to send in troops from your own country, because that creates a lot of opposition in our countries. So we see the case of Libya under Obama, overthrowing that government. And we see the continued efforts on the part of our governments to overthrow other countries by other means. And a lot of the means that they are using right now are economic means, these economic sanctions. We saw in Iraq how devastating those economic sanctions were, how hundreds of thousands of people met their deaths because of economic sanctions, and they are still portrayed today as an alternative to war. And we see them, the consequences of those economic sanctions in places across the globe, like from Cuba to Venezuela to Syria to North Korea. The other thing that is interesting to look at from the days of the invasion was how the US and the UK used the sympathy that the US had globally from the 9/11 attacks to create the conditions for the invasion and to build up this, quote, coalition of the willing by using that sympathy and also strong-arming countries around the world to join up in this invasion. And also to use the fear and anger on the part of Americans after 9/11 for that attack. And now juxtapose it today to get our country so deeply involved in the war in Ukraine, it's been harder to do that because the US and the UK have lost a lot of legitimacy because of the invasion of Iraq. I remember being at a protest about 2 weeks ago here in the United States, and somebody had a sign saying, "You lied to us about Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, and now you expect us to believe you about Ukraine." This is the same kind of thing that people of the global South are saying, while it's being touted that this global coalition has been built to be part of the war of Ukraine. The majority of people, particularly in the global South, remember what happened in Iraq, aren't so ready to believe the narrative, and most importantly, don't want to get involved in a war that they see as a proxy war between the West and Russia. So I also just want to say in closing that the Iraq war was an example of us as citizens doing our job. And I think in the US and the UK and then people around the world, the fact that we were able to build up this massive anti-war movement, and we still recall the February 15th, 2002, the unbelievably huge demonstrations. But then there is the fact that our governments ignored us. And I think that has created a lot of cynicism, especially here in the United States, about what good does it do to come out in large numbers to protest wars. And it's been very hard to overcome that cynicism and the understanding that our, quote, democracy doesn't work like it's supposed to, because the powers that be make the decisions and don't listen to what the people are saying. And now in the case of Iraq, we have a very difficult time both overcoming the media narrative as well as overcoming this sense of cynicism. So that is just to say that the Iraq War has left, of course, the deepest of scars, the deepest of wounds in Iraq itself. But in our societies, it's also left a lot of wounds that make it difficult for us to push our governments to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was also incredibly interesting. We've got some great questions coming through, so do put those in the Q&A. And we'll move now to our next speaker, Shadia Edwards-Dashti of the Stop the War Coalition. Shadia, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's really interesting to hear all of these discussions and reflections of the last 20 years on those really horrifically defining moments of this war that was based on lies and deceit, that saw so many thousands of deaths. As Sami and Medea have already mentioned, of course, it was a war that should never have happened. And we've heard of the history from Sami's descriptions. We've heard of the context today as well, that there was certainly no positives that can be drawn from such a war. For me, I was just 11 when the Iraq War was waged, and I remember on the television screens these awful images coming out onto the news as my parents were watching. And it was really awful to see. But of course, when you're that little, you only remember things in your mind as these defining milestone moments. And particularly as a young kid, it's just a concept, really. It's much more conceptual than being tangible or anything that I could really relate to. Seeing it through a television screen, I could barely really understand what was going on. However, there are moments in time in the war on terror that I could relate to, even as a very young child. So I'm specifically speaking about the ideological war on terror here. We heard earlier from Medea about the calculated imagery and the concept of fear fueling this war. That was very much at the forefront of the repercussions and consequences here in the United Kingdom of the war on terror. Because if we take the context of 9/11, for instance, the very next day I went into school. I was 9 years old in 2001, and a classmate ran up to me and he said, "Your dad's a terrorist." And he was 9 years old. To come out with something like that was, of course, very shocking. But at 9 years old, I didn't understand what that actually meant. So I went home and I said to my sister, "So-and-so said that dad's a terrorist." Now we have to think about what all of this means in the context, because if I didn't know what that word meant, then he didn't know what that word meant. And if he didn't know what that word meant, then who did? So we then look back and think, okay, well, of course, it's come from his parents. And that was the birth of this kind of language. And that was the birth of connecting my father, an Arab man, to terrorism through the color of his skin and the fact that he's Arab and Muslim. And that was the connection. And this is the ideological war on terror that the Iraq War, that the war in Afghanistan, that the war on terror has created. And we still hear of those sorts of stories and those consequences even today. 20 years on from that moment, I've experienced dozens of similar episodes, from microaggressions, but all the way to these really serious racism terms that are being described about me and my family regarding Islam and being Arab as well. So of course, Islamophobia is rife. In fact, even today, a poll was published that shows almost 50% of young Muslims in Britain have experienced Islamophobia. Now, I'm still classed as a young person, and therefore all those young people have been brought up in the United Kingdom in the context of the war on terror. The last 20 years have a direct impact on people all over Europe as well. through these connections of racism. Of course, 9/11 was a terrible attack, a mass murder on innocent civilians. No one doubts that it was an appalling mass murder. But 9/11 unleashed a response which it did not seek to understand what had prompted this attack, nor did it seek to understand the causes of this attack. Instead, this crude and juvenile simplistic analysis blamed the attack simply on fanaticism, and as a result, unleashed a most ferocious response using the law and the very principles upon which the law was founded to then create more law and more law and more law to crush communities like Arab communities, crush Muslim communities whose only crime was a belief in Islam. And so what we've seen in the UK is things like the PREVENT strategy. We've seen counter-terrorism law that directly is linked, whether we like it or not, to the Muslim population. And so this is what we mean by the ideological war on terror. And I think it's really important to look at it from that perspective as well, because as I say, it still lingers. If we look at the treatment of Jeremy Corbyn just yesterday, the decision to block him from standing as a Labour candidate, the attack on Jeremy Corbyn is also an attack on the anti-war movement. It's so ironic that Keir Starmer chooses this particular point in time on the 20th anniversary of the war in Iraq, a war that Jeremy Corbyn campaigned so vehemently against, to then penalise and punish him now. Instead, we see war criminals like Tony Blair being hailed and walking free, while somebody like Julian Assange is locked up. Why would Keir Starmer do that? Well, he simply wants to quell and silence and quash, gag anything that Jeremy Corbyn stands for, including his pro-peace stance. So we look at Keir Starmer as well upon his most recent visit to Kyiv when he was visiting President Zelensky. He said if he were to become the prime minister, there'd be no difference between a Labour government and a Tory government when it came to supporting the war. That's pretty alarming considering the UK has already supplied £2.3 billion in terms of supporting this war. We then have to look at Stop the War and their position on all of this. This is, again, a direct attack on the pro-peace movement and a direct attack on an organisation like Stop the War for everything that it represents. We know that back with the Iraq War, Stop the War organised one of the biggest demonstrations the UK has ever seen. And although I wasn't there, it still shapes the way I see the world, that particular demonstration. And it still galvanizes me as an anti-war activist, but as a person as well, that people power can make a difference, because we're still talking about that demonstration now, and we're still drawing on the successes of that demonstration now as well. And I've been involved in Stop the War for quite a long time, since I was 18. As I say, it has shaped me. And what we can see, though, is that history is in some senses being repeated. Those same arguments can be drawn upon again today. The government still pretends there's some sort of magic money tree. We see that the United Kingdom has given billions of pounds in military assistance to Ukraine. We also see that almost every sector in Britain is now on strike. Millions of people are plunging below the poverty line, but yet there's all that money to spend on war. And so really, as somebody that's been involved in Stop the War Coalition, we can draw on so many things then and now. There are so many victims of war, of course, the innocent civilians in those countries, but there is also a wider impact too on workers here that are paying the price in their salaries and their quality of living. We see many people too, like the ideological war. There are victims there too that makes pretty much anyone a target, even the little 9-year-old schoolgirl that was targeted back then as well. So it's really important to connect all of these dots when we look back on the 20 years that have been and gone, but also where we can take the movement today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Shadia, and really fascinating to hear from our panelists so far about both the impacts across the world and the impacts, of course, across generations. We've got our final speaker now, who's Matt Willgress, who's from today's organisers. Matt was also secretary of the LSE Stop the War Society from 2003 to 2005. And a founding supporter of Labour against the war in the run-up to the Afghan and Iraq wars. So, Matt.
Thanks, Ruth. And maybe Labour against the war is something that we need to kick off again at the moment. Thanks so much to Sami and others for giving the information on what happened in Iraq and why that human catastrophe mustn't be forgotten, as much as those like Blair who would like to rehabilitate the idea of humanitarian imperialism would like to do so. I'm going to cut back my speech a bit, as a lot of what I was going to say has been covered. But one point I would point out is that, like, as with the later war in Libya, the much sort of trumped up and, in my opinion, necessary demand to support national self-determination goes straight out the window when it conflicts with these occupations. And as Sami has pointed out, you see the sort of rights of multinationals to make obscene profits put ahead of the rights of people to govern their own destiny. I think it's also worth, when we look back 20 years, remembering that whilst nearly every Labour political figure here now, and indeed many from beyond Labour and across the spectrum, claim to have been against the war in Iraq, that simply wasn't the case at the time. The anti-war movement was also subject to intense demonisation from parts of the political establishment, including the government of the day, and much of the media, and that shouldn't be forgotten. And as Medea noted, last month was the anniversary, 20 years since that February 2003 march. And I remember that very well. Like, as Ruth mentioned, I was at the LSE University at the time, and we had over 1,000 people assemble, like, at the crack of dawn on Saturday morning, just at our campus for that demonstration. And we had a really vibrant Stop the War society that had different national groups in it, climate campaigners, and just people who were appalled at what was going on, in addition to, like, the established left groups. And as Shadia said, looking back now, I would not say, and we shouldn't accept the arguments of those who say that the anti-war movement made no difference. And we certainly shouldn't use the fact that we didn't stop the war in Iraq to not rebuild movements such as that today and in the future. One thing that I think is often forgotten is that many who attended their first protest in the UK that day, whilst devastated not to have prevented an unjust and illegal war, many were not lost to politics, actually, and it became a formative experience instead. And if you look at, for example, how popular Stop the War coalition was amongst people who joined in polling, amongst people who joined or rejoined Labour to back Jeremy when he was running for leader, we can see that. And also many people, I think, as Sami hinted at, have developed an analysis of imperialism and the political dishonesty of the ruling class for the first time, which isn't easily forgotten. And I also think there's little doubt that war on Iran, and possibly Korea too, was on Bush and Blair's agenda at some point, but did not materialise. And barriers were put up to that through the massive movements against the war in Iraq and the resistance of the Iraqi people. And additionally, here in Britain, I think the memory of how unpopular the war in Iraq was influenced politicians, including then Labour leader Ed Miliband, from not backing bombing Syria in Parliament in 2013. But as Shadia highlighted, I think with the Tories committing to a dangerous nuclear escalation policy, we need to again be standing up against our government's reactionary foreign policy agenda. We stand up to them on their reactionary domestic agenda, and we need to do the same on foreign policy. Personally speaking, I thought it was deeply concerning the other week when the Tories announced $5 billion extra on already recordly high levels of military spending, of which $3 billion of this $5 billion is new nuclear spending. Much of the opposition was actually saying it was not enough, including from sections of the Labour movement. That's despite the fact that our military spending is already the highest in Europe, one of the highest in the world, and our public sector is subject to never-ending cuts. At that demonstration that I mentioned in 2003, this is my closing bit, Tony Benn said, we'd formed a movement which was focused on opposing war in Iraq, but must be about other matters as well. He said it must be about the establishment of a Palestinian state. It must be about democracy in the Middle East. There is no democracy in Saudi Arabia or Iraq. And how about some democracy in Britain as well? Tony, of course, had recently retired from Parliament at that time and gave the rest of his life to building this and many other movements for peace and justice here and across the world. Jeremy Corbyn, still demonised, as Shadia mentioned, daily by much of the corporate media, over 3 years on from being Labour's leader, not least because his commitment to the causes of peace and justice internationally was, of course, often by Tony's side. And I think, to conclude, the left is in a difficult period here, but all around us we can also see campaigns against the ruling class offensive mushrooming, from the trade union strikes, as Shadia mentioned, to the growing community support for refugees, and as expressed, perhaps strangely, but very well in the support for Gary Lineker, and the growing climate justice action on the street. So let's rediscover the spirit of resistance we had in 2003 and build movements together for a better, more peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. We've had some amazing contributions. We have got some questions. There will be time for one round, I think. So just before we will finish with the questions, can I thank everyone who's taken part this afternoon, to our speakers and to everybody who's participated, and to the volunteer team. If you are able to make a donation towards the hosting costs, that would be fantastic. If you can become a Patreon supporter, that would be great. Labour Outlook can increase then its web presence and put on more events. And please do also consider joining Stop the War, Coalition, CND, and some of the other important campaigns that have been mentioned this evening. We really hope you've enjoyed the discussion today. The next discussion is going to be on why Palestine matters, and that's taking place on Monday, May the 15th at 6:30. So please do join us then, and make sure that you follow us on Twitter and Facebook. They're both at Labour Outlook, to keep up to date with what we're doing. So thank you again. I'm going to read out. We've got 6 questions. Some of them I will indicate which speaker. It would be great if you could particularly answer that. Please don't feel obliged to speak to all of the questions. We've probably got around 10 minutes left, so if each of the panelists could bear that in mind. I'll read them out, and then I'll invite people to respond in the order in which they originally spoke, if that's okay. So the first question, perhaps for Shadia or Matt, how do you think Britain and the US's foreign policy in Iraq shape domestic policy? Is there a relationship between the growth of virulently Islamophobic organisations in the noughties, like the EDL, and official government policy on, for example, extraditions to Guantanamo Bay? This one is from Sami, from Patrick. Thank you, Sami, an excellent thought-provoking presentation. Could you please say something about the dynamics and strengths of the Iraqi resistance to the US presence in Iraq now? Thank you. Question from Annie. Isn't it really the case that every time the USA wage a war against an underdeveloped country or a so-called one, it's to loot the mineral resources of this country first and then plunder everything else they can lay their hands on, like General Electric with electricity? From Chris, hi from Stockport. Blair strides around the planet earning millions. Is there any realistic prospect of indicting him? Fifth one, perhaps for Medea or Matt, what's the potential for Lula's return in Brazil to offer a voice for peace on the world stage? And a final one, which is from one of our panelists, so thank you, Medea. Question for Sami, can you talk more about the role of Iran in Iraq today? So I will go straight to Sami, and if you are able to give us your thoughts on those, Sami. Thank you. You're muted at the moment, Sami, sorry.
Yeah, in my contribution, I stress that Iraq is semi-occupied, semi-independent. And I use the word semi because in Iraq, there is powerful political, social, many forms of types of resistance to US presence in the country. So there is a sort of balance of forces in the country where on the one hand, the US is the dominant external power, but domestically, there's a lot of pushback and resistance by the Iraqi people. And resistance does include armed resistance. There are several organizations in the country which are armed and which have threatened to escalate against US presence in the country. But I would say that the main current form is more political and social against US presence. The armed presence is very powerful, but they have not declared a full-on onslaught on the US presence. There are numerous political reasons why. Perhaps there is no time to go into it, but accept from me that there are powerful armed groups in the country who would join in any declaration of armed resistance against US presence. The main form of the current resistance is political, social, and so forth. The country is always on an edge in that sense, that as soon as the US tries to intervene very nakedly and directly, there is a threat of huge clash with the US presence in the country. So it's a flow and ebb situation. The main power of the US lies in their presence within the state apparatus that they built after the war. So much of the state apparatus is dominated, and of course, the main political forces that they arm and back. So they mainly act through those forces. And the conflict between the US and the Iraqi people has taken many complex and varied forms. As to the role of Iran, Iran has close links with a number of Iraqi groups, political groups. Some, the most vocal of them, openly have a political program in support of Iran, its political system. They would like Iraq to also move in a similar direction, and so on. These political groups, and some are even armed groups, their main focus is US presence in Iraq. So politically, they would raise the problem of Iraq being dominated by the United States. They are also, in terms of some of their armed groups that support Iran, also declare now and then that they would launch an open war if the US does certain acts within Iraq, or against Syria, or against Iran. So they are, if you like, part of what is being termed today as the resistance groups against Israel and the United States, stretching from Lebanon to Syria, to Iraq, to Yemen. There is a broad umbrella nowadays being termed as the axis of resistance against the United States and Israeli presence in the area. And Iraqi groups that are supportive of Iran describe themselves as well as part of that broad umbrella.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll move straight to the next panelist, which was Medea. Thank you.
Yes, I want to take the two questions, one about how the Iraq war has affected domestic policies, and then the one about Lula. In terms of domestic policies, well, it's been an absolute disaster because it really marked in modern US history, the massive amount of money put into the military justified by these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We see today that the US, the budget for the military for the year 2023 is really about $1 trillion now. And how does that affect domestic politics? Well, it means we don't have money for a healthcare system. We don't have money for the Green New Deal. We don't have money for affordable college education, on and on. So it's had a huge impact on domestic politics. And then the other way it is impacting our politics is that after the Iraq war, there was created this called 1033 program to take excess, quote, excess surplus weapons and other war material from the Pentagon and give that out to police stations around the country. And so the police forces in the United States have become so militarized with tanks and grenades and assault weapons. And that has led to an increase in police violence and, of course, the rise of movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. So we see the war and the violence overseas coming back to haunt us at militarism at home, not only from our police departments, but the increase in domestic violence that's been tied to the veterans coming home from those wars, the increase in suicides from veterans from those wars, and general destabilization in our own societies. The mass shootings we have in the United States, many of them, I think it's over 60%, are carried out by people who have been involved in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And then lastly, about this issue of Lula, because it is nice to end on a more positive note. And thank you, Matt, for turning the protests February 15th into a more positive one, other than my reflections on how it made people feel cynical. It is to say that there is this movement from leaders in the global South to play a role to push aside the United States and others who are the warmongers, to try to push Russia to the negotiating table, to push Ukraine to the negotiating table. And that is not only coming from the Secretary General and the Pope, but it's coming from leaders with a tremendous amount of legitimacy in the global South, like Lula. And were it not for him getting sick with pneumonia, he would be in China today talking to the Chinese about creating this peace club of nations who would be able to mediate this horrific conflict in Ukraine. And I want to close by saying the words he told to Biden when Biden met with him and asked him if he would join by sending weapons to Ukraine. And he, reflecting the sensibilities of the global South, he said, we don't want to join this war, we want to end this war. So I think, yes, he could and will play a very important role.
Thank you very much indeed. We now turn to Shadia.
Thanks. On the question about foreign policy, domestic policy, what I would say is that foreign policy is domestic policy and domestic policy is foreign policy. I don't think we should ever separate the two, because both of them are completely interlinked. The way the British government conducts itself abroad directly impacts people here in a domestic sense. For instance, all of that money being spent and being put into this proxy war in Ukraine has a direct impact on the workers' rights here in the United Kingdom. We have workers on strike. We have nurses that were clapped during COVID now being clapped out of hospitals, having to quit their jobs because they can't pay their bills, rising rent, transport's going up, cost of living is absolutely sky high. But the government says there's no money. The government that says, sorry, we've absolutely run out of funds. Having said that, it can supply all of this military assistance, financial military assistance abroad. So therefore, I don't think that we can ever say that these two types of policies are not linked. Foreign policy is absolutely domestic policy, and everything in that sense is of a political nature. When people are complaining that they can't afford their bills, that is of a political nature that can be stemmed and linked to something like a wider agenda of the military war complex. And I think it's really important as activists to make those connections known so that people have a wider understanding of what is really going on. In the same sort of sense, in terms of the way that policy has been influenced and how it's sort of filtered through in recent years with the growth of Islamophobic groups, again, it's very much interlinked. If we look at our Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, before her predecessor, Priti Patel, you would say you could never get any worse than Priti Patel. Yet here we are, 10 times worse. And that's really scary because it makes Theresa May look like a lovely lady, because she was spearheading the Windrush and the hostile environment then. And now we would sort of almost pray to get Theresa May back in charge of the Home Office, which is a really scary thing to say, but that just goes to show how much further we are being pushed into the right when it comes to that. And I do think there is a huge element that these Islamophobic groups, these racist groups, can actually make a difference, because they sow the seeds and lay the foundations bare for politicians to then stamp down their far right policy on top of. And that is something that we can have a direct impact on. And you do see that activists have got very much more involved when it comes to supporting refugees and asylum seekers, saying that they are welcome here. Because the United Kingdom always held itself on being this multicultural place where we welcome everybody. That's certainly not the case anymore. But right now, there's a whole movement that is growing to support refugees and asylum seekers. And the biggest way to support refugees and asylum seekers is simply to stop creating them. What I mean by that is stop waging war. And therefore, if you stop waging war, you will not see as many people seeking refuge in other countries. It's as simple as that. Our foreign policy has created this refugee crisis. And that is probably one of the most important things when it comes to the Stop the War Coalition, that argues that waging these wars is creating such a terrible environment that people are becoming so displaced. And some asylum seekers and refugees, they're coming to the United Kingdom and it takes them years to get here, absolute years to get here, and risking their lives to seek a better life. And so I would say all of that completely stems and is linked to the growth of racist and Islamophobic groups in the UK. And that link has to be made known too.
Thank you very much indeed. Sorry, slight delay, and I'm muting myself there. Thank you. And our final answers to the questions will be from Matt. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Matt, to close.
Thanks, Ruth. Very quickly, on Lula, I agree with Medea. I think there's the reason that there's this kind of demonization in sections of the press about Lula supporting Putin or supporting the invasion of Ukraine, which isn't true, is because that is a credible sort of proposal to bring in for peace. And I think people like that, is very important that those things are studied as they actually are, and not how some people are seeking to present them. In terms of other things that come up in the discussion and the questions, 2 quick points. One is on the Jeremy Corbyn matter, which Shadia mentioned. Please do sign the petition, which over 55,000 people have signed, that's been put in the chat. And please do read the sum up of the people supporting Jeremy. And from a Labour Outlook point of view, also please keep helping us raise the other issues of democracy in the Labour Party and indeed the broader Labour movement that this issue brings up, because it's not just there where democracy in the Labour movement and Labour Party is being denied. In terms of priorities going forward to sort of close the event, I think that we need to have a real systematic united front campaign against the increases in military spending. And we need to hammer those arguments through in the Labour movement, reversing the TUC motion last year about building more weapons, which very narrowly carried, bringing into that alliance people who we might not agree with on some foreign policy current matters, but don't just agree with building new nuclear weapons and building more weapons, and say that we want people, planet and peace to come first. Thank you also everyone for coming, and thank you Ruth for chairing, and to all our panelists.